They finalized the land today. It was in the headlines.
Yes.
So.
Okay, Becky.
All right, testing. All right. I'll edit this out. Well, good afternoon again. Thank you so much for coming. It's great to see some familiar faces out there. And I want to get right to our program. You read in my email, Barb has been with the King County Forest Preserve. And before that, I know she was very involved in environmental work even before she got to get paid for it, right? So anyway, Barb McKittrick, come on up and tell us about the overstory.
Thank you, Becky. Thank you all for coming out on what's looking to be the start of a pretty miserable day. But for those of us who work outside for a living, every day is good. So it's winter, and this is what we expect in winter in Chicago. So yeah, as Becky said, and thank you for that nice introduction, I do work for the Forest Preserve District of Kane County now. And I am lucky enough to be able to, yes, to get paid for being outdoors, not to actually read books about nature, but to be here talking about nature is part of my job. But I've always loved the outdoors. I grew up in Chicago next to a forest preserve, and I learned to love nature in an urban setting. And I hope that all of you might take that as a hint. You don't have to live on a 100-acre estate to have nature right there in your own backyard. You might just have a balcony and you have a potted plant out there. That is still nature. But what I'd like to talk about today are trees. And I want to start out with a story. I've always loved the woods, even when I was in Chicago. The Forest Preserve near me had beautiful trails through the woods. It was always a really great escape for me. There's a lot of literature out there now that talks about the benefits of going for a walk in nature, breathing in the chemicals that the trees release, walking on the spongy soil with all the moss underneath your feet, seeing the light dappling through the trees like this picture showed. So when the pandemic came around, I, like a lot of us, had more time on my hands, and I decided to take up a new hobby. I wouldn't say I'm a creative person. I can't sing, I don't play an instrument, I'm not really very artistic, but I took up painting. And what better topic to paint for me than trees and woods, my happy place. So I spent some time. This is the final product here. I wouldn't call myself a Picasso. This is a paint by number. And it took me 2 years to do, but I finished it. It's hanging in my bedroom. Every time I look at it, I am reminded of the beauty and the wonder and the joy of walking in a woodland. So why do I tell you this story? I'm supposed to be up here talking about a book. Well, at its heart, the understory, which is a very long book for those of you who haven't seen it, we're talking over 500 pages, is at its heart a story about trees. There's a lot of hardcore botanical science in the book. It's really well researched. You learn a lot by reading the book. But the author, Richard Powers, knows that the best arguments in the world, the most science, the most statistics, aren't going to change a person's mind. And he wanted to change the reader's mind about how they think about trees. But he knew that the only thing that can really do that is a good story. And he put this quote in the book as one of his characters' quotations. So Adam Apich is actually one of the characters in the understory. So this was Richard Powers' goal, to tell a story. This is a nonfiction, this is a fiction, a work of fiction, but there's a lot of science and nonfiction built into it. Richard Powers is known for, he's kind of the most famous unknown author out there. He's pretty prolific, and he really does a great job of researching most of his books. He dives into it. So I think he's done a very good job, and he's told a good story. A lot of good stories, actually. Just by the number of awards the book has won, you can tell that it's highly regarded, that it's well written, that it's received a lot of critical acclaim. It is the winner of the Pulitzer Prize in Fiction, which is about as big as you can get in the world of fiction. but it's also won multiple other awards, and it was even on the New York Times bestseller list for quite a long time. So this tells you that it's a great book, right? At least by those who claim to know what a great book is. But I think one of the biggest credentials that the book has is by one of the richest and most powerful men in the world, Bill Gates. This is a quote on Bill Gates' blog. He's a pretty prolific reader. And he says that this novel, The Overstory, changed how he looks at trees. Consider, does anyone know where Bill Gates lives? He lives near Seattle, right? This is a mecca of beautiful, grandiose conifer trees, giant Douglas firs and cedar trees. He knows a beautiful tree, but by reading this book, he doesn't even just know them. He loves them and appreciates them, and it's changed how he thinks about trees. It changed how I think about trees. I hope that you will read the book. Has anyone in here read The Overstory? Has it changed the way you think about trees?
Absolutely.
Perfect. He's accomplished what he wanted to do then. Writing the book, researching the book, even changed the way the author thinks about trees. I mean, consider that. He knew he wanted to write a book about trees. He knew he wanted to convey it through stories and stories about people, because that's really what resonates with us. We all love to hear stories about people. He made some of the trees that he presents in the book take on the personifications of a person. But through all of this research, writing the book changed his life dramatically. So Richard Powers, this is Richard, I'll tell you where he is in a minute, is a hometown guy. He was born in Evanston. He spent time in Lincolnwood, went to grammar school there, moved away for a bit, then came back, went to high school in DeKalb, and he's a graduate of the University of Illinois. So he spent a lot of time here, and a lot of the locations that are mentioned in the book are Midwestern towns. I'll talk about them in a minute. As close as Wheaton. So, he's local. He's a local boy. But after graduating from U of I, he went to Stanford, and he was a professor there. So Stanford is in the Silicon Valley. It's in California, out amongst the giant redwoods. That's where he first experienced, this member of the sequoia genus, and he really, fell deeply in love with trees there. That's what spurred him to write The Overstory. When he was researching the book, he wanted to get into not just a redwood, sequoia forest, but some other old growth forests. So he traveled to the East Coast, to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, which any of you have been there will know that is just a mecca for eastern deciduous old growth forests. There are acres and acres of gigantic old growth large trees, and he truly fell in love with trees there, to the point that he moved to the Smoky Mountains National Park area, and he still lives there today. And by his own words, he is now a fanatic about trees. So, how often does that happen? He not only changes our mind about trees, the reader, but his own. So the Overstory is a very long book, and I'll be honest, I struggled with packing all of the stories and the feeling that the book conveys into a presentation. Those of you who have read the book probably know what I'm talking about. There's a lot there. There are a lot of characters, there are a lot of themes. Sometimes it doesn't even seem like they're going to be tied together, but they do at the end for the most part. Now, someone in the audience is in my book club, and Amy knows that we discussed The Overstory at our book club. Not everyone loved it. And part of it is because it is a little bit difficult to follow. There's so much going on. It's also at times a bit depressing. We all know that there are things going on, conservation and ecology-wise in the world today, that aren't uplifting. And Richard Powers does not shy away from talking about that. That's part of the reason that he wrote this book, to convey this understanding of how deforestation is affecting our forests, how our use of natural resources is really, we're using more than we're replacing. So he presents a lot of this very deep, very difficult to digest information in the book. And he organizes the book. This is very creative. I just really love the way he organized it and presented the information. He organizes the chapters in the book like a tree. The beginning of the book starts out with a roots section. And that's about 150 pages, where he introduces the characters in his book. There are 9, and it's almost like it is written as 9 individual short stories. These 9 people are not connected. Some of them are knowledgeable about trees, some of them aren't. They couldn't tell you a maple from an oak. But by the end of the book, all of the characters have learned to appreciate and want to protect trees through different journeys that I'll get into in a minute. But after the roots section of the book, the next section is called the trunk. And a lot of the characters, 5 of them, 5 of the 9, come together in that section and start working to protect, well, try to protect old growth trees through activism, which eventually turns into eco-terrorism. There's a difference. To try to protect the remaining old growth forests that we have. Then the other 3 characters are kind of on the edge, sort of getting involved, but not totally. But after those characters come together in the trunk section and Richard Powers kind of interweaves their stories, something happens, something bad happens, where they spread out again, like the crown of a tree. They break away again and go and lead their separate lives. And then the last section, I should say the trunk is the major portion of this book. There are 200 pages of these 5 people working together to protect trees in their protestations, where the other 3 are going about their lives. Split apart in the crown section and continue on their separate ways for 125 pages. And then the end is the seeds section, where Richard Powers describes how the ideas and the actions of this group, there are 8 left at the end, people might go on and change the world. It's short, it's only 30 pages. So a lot of build-up, a lot of descriptive writing, a lot of beautiful writing. Another reason that I loved the book wasn't because of the ecology and the botany, which I kind of lean towards anyways, but just beautifully written descriptions of walking in the woods and the beauty and the peace that you get from doing that. So that was the organization. Let's meet some of the characters in the book. There were 9 major characters, human characters, I should say. All very different walks of life, different understandings of trees to begin with, but they all learn something about trees and internalize the desire to protect trees by the end. So we'll get into them each in a little bit more, but there are also trees that the author paints as characters here. The trees are alive in the Overstory. They are described in anthropomorphic ways that have human traits, and you feel for the trees, especially one that we'll get to. The main trees, though, there are 5. So some characters are intimately connected with one species of tree for one reason or another. But the 5 major trees that he presents in his book and gives a lot of information about. First off, does anyone know what this tree is?
The distance.
You in the back? No. It's no surprise that most of you, well, no one knows, because we don't see this tree anymore. This is the American chestnut. It used to be 50% of the East Coast forest was composed of American chestnut trees. It was a beautiful forest tree, fast-growing tree leaves that were used by Native Americans for medicine, nuts that are highly edible by humans and animals, wildlife, and wood that was the wood of choice for a lot of construction and furniture. So a beautiful tree that has been nearly eradicated by a fungal disease, by the chestnut blight. So this tree is virtually gone from the US, with the exception of a couple of isolated remainders. They're trying to crossbreed the American chestnut seeds remaining with the Chinese chestnut, so we might see it introduced again, but at this stage, don't often see an American chestnut tree. Most of us know this tree though. A lot of us might hate it because of the fruit that falls all over the sidewalk. It's one that we see here. This is a mulberry tree. There's something interesting about the mulberry, and that is not just the fruit, which is pretty tasty. I've made pies with it. It's actually a good tree. But Powers gets into one of the characters is intimately tied to the mulberry tree. It's the only tree that's the host plant of the silk moth. So silk is made from mulberry leaves. This is not a tree we see around here. It's a tropical tree. Anyone know this one? Kapok is what you often hear in Florida. You'll hear it called a kapok. It's a banyan tree. It's a member of the fig family. And all of those roots that you see coming down can start new trees. So this clonal growth of trees can go on indefinitely, can create gigantic colonies. This is the giant redwood. Sequoia, a member of the sequoia family. Can be 3,000 years old, 300 feet tall. It's a beautiful tree. And this is a ponderosa pine, another very tall, 200-foot tall species that you see on the west coast of the United States. So these are the 5 trees that play the biggest role in the understory and that Powers described quite a bit as he gets into the human character stories. So let's go through, I'll try to introduce these characters to you so that you can get a feel of who's in the understory, what are they doing? So Nicholas Hole is the first character that we meet, and Nicholas is really intimately tied to the American chestnut. We meet Nicholas when he is a child. He lives in Iowa. This tree at the time, so this is contemporary times that the book is written in. The tree's still there when he is a child, which is unusual because almost all of them in the United States have been killed, and Iowa was not part of the native range of the American chestnut. But his great-great-great-great-grandfather was an immigrant to the U.S., and he had chestnuts growing in his home on the East Coast. When he took his family and moved them west in the early 1800s, with the first wave of European settlers coming out, he pocketed some of those seeds and he planted them in his yard in Iowa. And this is the tree that Nick saw as he was growing up. It was very unusual, and it was it was full grown at that point. It was a giant, lovely flowering tree. When Nicholas's great-great-great-grandfather planted the tree, his son got into photography. This was early stages of cameras. And he started taking pictures of this tree from the same spot once a month through his whole life. And he passed down that hobby to his son and his son. 5 generations of the whole family were taking pictures of the same tree from the same spot over its growth history, and they put together a flip book that you could flip through and see the tree growing. And it was an amazing thing because the tree was a rare tree, and that a family would take this amount of time to photograph it. It was just amazing and incredible. It was a beautiful piece of art, and it really influenced Nick. He really got into the project. He loved art. It really turned him into an artist, and he was a good artist. He sketched the chestnut, and he grew up to be an artist. That was his full-time gig. And you could say that the American chestnut actually saved his life. Nick's family was visiting his home in Iowa, and he went to an art conference. He came home, and his entire family had died of carbon monoxide poisoning while he was away at the art conference. So, pretty sad story. Nick was kind of a lost soul. I think you feel, I don't know, he's not married, he has some friends, but he seems lonely. He seems really buried in his world of art. Second character is Mimi Ma. Mimi was the gal who grew up in Wheaton. She was the daughter of a Chinese immigrant whose family was very wealthy back in China, and they made their money from silk production. They had mulberry trees, and so when they settled in Wheaton, Mimi's dad, you met her as a little girl, he planted a mulberry tree in his wheaten yard as the start of his new silk farm. And he wasn't a farmer, he was a very smart engineer. He developed one of the first cell phones, but he had a love of nature on the side, kind of like I did. I was a consultant, but I loved nature as a hobby, and now I do it as a job. But he took his kids camping, he got them out in the woods, he really influenced them to care about nature and trees, including Mimi. She did. Her dad's name was Winston. He kept careful journals of all their camping sites. He was definitely an engineer. He was a scientific-minded dude. He died. Mimi's mom got dementia, and she died shortly thereafter. Her father committed suicide. He was buried nearby, but he left his daughters, he had 3 daughters, including Mimi and her 2 sisters, a lot of money. Most of it, though, tied up in the form of these 2 artifacts. One was this beautiful tapestry of arhats, ancient Chinese symbol that was worth a lot of money. And the other, each of the 3 girls got a jade ring circled around with a beautiful carving of a particular tree. And Mimi's was the mulberry. After her dad died, the sisters kind of split up, and Mimi became an engineer, just like her dad, and she moved to the West Coast. And that's where, this is all in the roots section. That's where it leaves her. Then we meet Adam. Adam was one of my favorite characters. We meet Adam as a little boy, and he is in a family of 4. His dad plants a particular species of tree for each of the 4 kids. Adam's is a maple tree. It's kind of a dysfunctional family. It's amazing that the dad actually takes the time to plant these trees. He's abusive. It's not a very happy childhood. One of Adam's sisters actually runs away in childhood and just disappears off the face of the earth. They don't know what happens to her. He turns inward. Adam becomes a fabulous reader, spends a lot of time reading nature books. He loves nature. He just, wants to get outside all the time, spend all his time out there. He loves the little golden book field guides. I don't know if those of you who have children, these are still popular today. And honestly, as an environmental educator, they're really educational for adults too. I highly encourage the whole series of golden guides. But he wasn't fed at home. His mother and father really didn't fuel his love of nature. One day, this is probably the saddest part in the book to me, he comes home and he had this collection of all these found items, different seeds and skulls and things that he had, in his personal altar to nature. And his mom just took and threw them all in the garbage. And he came home from school one day and they were just gone. Just very sad. That combined with he spent hours studying ants. That was one of his passions. Taking nail polish and dabbing it on the abdomen of the ants and watching where they would go. And he did a science project on this for school, took it to school, and it was excellent, for a grade schooler, so much so that the adults judging the science fair thought he was cheating and that he had plagiarized the work and discredited it. So this combination of things, no support at home, being bashed down at school, he gave up. He abandoned all of his love of nature, and he turned in all his childish things and just, grew out of it, left it behind. It was a really sad feeling to read and to see that squashed in a child. So he then decided he was going to study psychology in college, and not that there's anything wrong with psychology, and sociology, and moved to the West Coast to go to college, and nothing to do with nature anymore. Wasn't going to be his thing. I mentioned not all of the characters had an innate love or even knowledge or care of trees. These 2 didn't. Ray Brinkman was an attorney. He lived in St. Paul and lived there the entire book. He met his wife, Dorothy, at work. She was a law clerk. And as the quote said, it wouldn't be hard to find two people to whom trees mean almost nothing. At times, reading the book, you would, at this part, especially in Ruth's section, what do these people have to do with the story? Again, these are 9 separate individual short stories, and they seem to be way out there. But they met at work, at the law office. They both got involved in community theater, and I don't know, it was a kind of a quirky passion that they had on the side. That's where they fell in love, in the theater, and they ended up getting married. No mention of a tree anywhere in the story. Next, we're almost to the end here, and you can see there's just so much stuff, so many people. Douglas Pavlicek. Doug was another kind of a lost soul. He graduated from high school. We meet him as a young adult, and he participates in this prison experiment. So this is where a bunch of people are agree to be locked into a prison as part of a sociology experiment to see what would happen under conditions. And they were studied, and Doug and many of the other participants really lost their humanity. I mean, there was torture going on. They kind of turned on each other, kind of like Lord of the Flies-esque. And Doug did not like what he turned into in this experiment. It finally ended. He signed up as a pilot in the Vietnam War, and he went to Vietnam. His helicopter ended up being shot down, and he fell into a banyan tree. So the tree saved his life. So he had a connection to trees. I wouldn't say he was a lover of trees before that, but after that he did. And after he came home then from being, his life being saved by the tree, he became kind of a vagrant, a drifter. He didn't really have a career. He was, like I said, a lost soul, just wandering the country, driving around, taking odd jobs. He ended up in Oregon, on the West Coast, and he was just driving around one day, and he was in a national forest. And as a lot of you might know, our national forests are protected land, but we allow logging and we allow ranching in national grasslands. And he knew that. He said that he could accommodate the fact that Smokey the Bear and Ranger Rick were being funded by Weyerhaeuser and other logging companies. But what he was really incensed at is that as he was driving down the road out there in Oregon, it looked to him like it was still solid forest. Along the roads there were many trees, but then he stopped, and I don't remember what he had to do, but he walked beyond the edge that was along the road, just a little bit behind that, and it was clear cut. It was a trick. It was a beauty curtain, which is a strategy that the logging companies do use. As you're driving, you don't realize the clear cuts that have gone on beyond these beauty strips. And he was just, I don't know, he had a hard life already, and he was just so discombobulated by this and so depressed that he's like, all right, I'm going to try to fix something. And he took a job planting Douglas fir seedlings for a logging company to try to reforest the areas that had been clear cut, which is what logging companies do, and they tend to plant monocultures of Douglas fir. They're relatively quick growing conifers. So he started working hard and feeling better about himself and the world by planting these seedlings. Nile, another completely different character that we meet. Again, not much connection to trees. We meet Nile as about a 7-year-old boy. His dad is one of the first employees of a Silicon Valley startup, so they live in the San Francisco Bay Area. And he brings home a computer one day. No one knew what a computer was at that point. This is like one of those old generation, I don't know if it's an Apple IIc, that was my first computer. He brings it home, and He's a coder, he's a software engineer, Nilay's dad, and he gets his son really excited about the potential of computers. They're going to change the world. And Nilay, as a young boy, has started to learn to code. He was a very smart boy, and he loved his dad. So they spent a lot of time together doing this activity, and he became really good at it. So much so that he was keeping a journal of all the things that he was going to do on the computer, games he was going to build, and pursuits that he was going to work on with his dad. And he took his journal to school, and one day his teacher saw him looking at his journal when he should have been listening to her or studying, and she took it away from him, and he was horrified. You know, his life was in that journal. That's what meant the most to him. So he left school, and he just, you know, wanted to escape, and he climbed a big tree, and he fell from that tree, and he broke his back, and he became a paraplegic for life from that fall. So it changed his life. You know, the tree, I guess, was a negative influence in his case. Not that he looked at it that way. But he kept his passion for computers, and he kept, you know, coding on the side, which he could still do from the wheelchair that became his new home. You know, he was good at it. You know, he was great at it. He was a savant. He ended up going to college at Stanford and as a computer science person. He, at school, he went into a tree greenhouse, and he had a vision. There were some mystical things in the book, and this was one of them. He had a vision about the type of game he was going to create in his career, and it was about building civilizations, ecosystems. Does anyone here children play World of Warcraft? Well, I did, and so it's one of those MMR games, multiplayer, online, role-playing games where you build new worlds. And so this was Nilay's vision. It's going to be one of the first ones. Patricia, my favorite character. Patricia was a forestry professional. She had a PhD in forestry. We meet her as a young girl. Her dad is an ecologist. He teaches her about trees, all about trees, to love trees. She does love trees more than people. She is a very introverted little girl. She just wants to spend time with her dad and to spend time among the trees. She's so close to her dad. He ends up dying in high school, and she's really lost without him, but she carries on. She finally makes it out of high school with all the mean girls, and she goes on to college. She earns her PhD. She moves to Madison. She's writing her thesis, and it's about how trees communicate with each other, releasing volatile chemicals through the air. Say an insect attacks one tree, releases a chemical received by another to know to ramp up production of anti-insecticide chemicals in that tree. So it was a revolutionary concept that Patricia described in her thesis, and it was debunked by the scientific community. She was ostracized, she was criticized, she lost her job. Her research was not believed, even though it was valid. Her life is based on a real-life scientist, Susan, whose last name I'm forgetting, who is a Canadian forester. So she's one character that's based on a real person. She ends up, you know, just kind of drifting west, looking for odd jobs because she can't get anything in her field anymore. Ends up in a cabin in the U.S. Forest Service cabin, becoming a park ranger, well below, you know, her capabilities. But she's happy, she's in the woods, and no one can bother her. She doesn't have to see people. She doesn't want to see people. She wants to retreat from the world. She even tries to commit suicide once, but doesn't carry through with it. She's very depressed, happy among the trees, but not happy with people. Until one day she's out wandering and she sees a group of research scientists out there studying some decomposing logs. She's like, and they recognize her. And like, you are Patricia Westerford, Dr. Westerford, and she's shocked. And she's scared. You know, she's afraid of people at this point, and what they're going to say about her research. They're like, your research has been vindicated. You are famous. Will you come and work with us? And she does. She's readmitted to the world of science. She meets and falls in love with one of these guys that's out there named Dennis, and they get married. So it's kind of a happy ending there. If there's one character that will change your mind about how you look at trees, it's Patricia. Not only does she share, it's the author's character to share all this botanical science with you, and he goes into how trees communicate through the air and through their mycorrhizal fungal networks. You know, it's all valid science. It's wonderful stuff, but it's beautifully written. So these are just two of so many beautiful snippets of writing describing what it's like to be in the woods. Patricia's writing this. The top one is what it would be like to be in an aspen forest on the Colorado Plateau. Just, you know, those glimmering leaves, the white trunks, the cadmium mirrors flickering against the righteous blue sky. Just makes you feel, boy, I'd like to be there. And then the second one is a very different feeling about being in a very deep, dark hemlock forest in the Cascadian mountain range in Washington. You know, a lot of things that are dying but decomposing, and all types of webs of life woven into a single cubic foot. So just very evocative, beautiful writing by Patricia. And lastly, Olivia Vandergrift is our ninth and final character. Olivia is a college senior when we meet her. She's going to school, at an underschool school in Pennsylvania. By all accounts, she is a selfish, mean girl. All she really cares about at college is hash and music. She doesn't really, you know, she knows she's going to graduate soon. She has no idea what she's going to do. She doesn't really care. She's getting high all the time and having fun and being mean to people. She doesn't care about trees. There's even a sentence in there. She walks past ginkgo trees, which are a beautiful tree, you know, from the time of dinosaurs. She doesn't even see them. She doesn't care about trees. She goes out one night, comes home, she gets stoned, she takes a shower, she lays down on her bed, and she goes to switch the light off. You know, this is a typical college kind of ramshackle house that my kids lived in. And the wiring is off, she touches it, she's electrocuted, and she dies. So we think. So there we go. Those are the 9 characters, humans, and the trees that define them. Richard Powers goes on then to weave 5 of those characters together into a play of somehow coming to the point that they want to protect and save trees in the trunk section. The 5 that do so are Olivia, Nick, Mimi, Douglas, and Adam. Through different paths, they all end up migrating, moving to Northern California, the Sequoia Range, the giant redwood area. They only grow in a very small strip between Northern California and Oregon. Olivia just said she was dead, right? Well, she wasn't. Spoiler alert. She was dead for a minute, but then she somehow rolled off the bed, and that sparked, you know, she was shocked back into life. So it was like one of those, you know, death experiences that she survived. When she did, okay, this is the other mystical part of the book, which I don't typically like in books, but it's part of the story. She had a vision of, okay, you need to drive, these voices in her head saying, quit school, don't be so mean, drive west, young lady, and you have been saved, your life has been saved so that you can save trees. So here's a woman that cared nothing about trees, and now this is going to be the focus of her life. So she starts driving west, and on her way, she sees a sign on the road that says, free tree art. She's like, trees, me, trees. So she stops, and she stops at Nick's home, He of the American Chestnut and the Chestnut Flip book, and he's an artist, right? He's a good artist. No one will buy his art. Again, he's a lost soul, even though he's a wonderful artist. And she is enthralled by his paintings that he's giving away for free to anyone who wants them. And she's like, I'll take one of those. And by the way, you want to come with me and go protest about trees? And she's very dynamic at this point. She's very convincing. She's a true leader. And he's like, yeah, I'll go with you. I have nothing else to do. The whole chestnut was dying. He was depressed about that. He didn't really have any reason to stay. His family had died from the carbon monoxide poisoning, so why not? So he joined her, and they continued their drive. And on the way, they stopped at a home goods store, and there all these TVs around. They were showing a protest going on in the Sequoia Range. And they're like, that's where we're going. We're going to join that movement. So they kept on heading that way, with the aim of ending up at that movement. In the meantime, Mimi, the daughter of the Chinese immigrant with the mulberry tree, she has now become an engineer and lives in the Portland area. And she's a very successful engineer, hard worker. Outside of her office window, she sees a stand of ponderosa pines. It reminds her of her dad and all the camping trips that they took together. And the city says they're going to cut those trees down. And she is very angry about this because they bring her a lot of peace, just looking out her window at them. And she, starts a little movement to prevent the city from doing this. She puts posters up. And Douglas, who happened to wander out to Portland by this point, sees the posters, and he's always one for a cause. He had been disillusioned. He was out there planting all of his Douglas fir seedlings to try to reforest the cuts. And he stopped in a bar once, and he's like, oh, I'll buy everyone a drink. I just planted my 500th Douglas fir seedling. And a guy in the bar was like, that's nothing. That's just a monoculture of trees that's making the logging company happy. And it really disillusioned him. He was just so depressed. He was looking for a cause. So when he saw Mimi's poster, he jumped on board, and he went and protested as well. He ended up getting arrested. He was let out pretty quickly. Mimi didn't. He met Mimi. The bottom line, the trees were cut. And this is what kind of got them wanting to do more than just put up a poster to protect trees. They started protesting more and eventually made their way to this organized protest group in Northern California. Adam is our sociology student, the one who was a little boy that loved nature. Now he's at Santa Cruz. He's in college, and he needs to do a thesis project. His advisor advises him, why don't you go to this protest movement just a little ways north, talk to the protesters and get into their minds as to what they're thinking in terms of protest for your thesis. So he heads up there to do that. He interviews the people that he meets, and he is swayed to their cause too. He returns to school to finish his thesis, but now he ends up being a tree lover also. But they're all converging here, at least these 5. At first, the activists are peaceable. And this mini story within the trunk is also based on real life happenings. There was a group in the 70s when protesting clear cutting and cutting of old growth forests was pretty prominent in the news. And this group, the Free Cascadia movement, was a real group that they started as peaceful protesters, like this group of 5 now friends did. They verbally protested, they marched with signs. In this group's case, they had an artist that painted beautiful butterflies on some of the cut branches of the trees. He used that spray art to cover them. And a very important part of the book that took probably 100 pages was when Olivia and Nick, who is now in love with Olivia, she's so dynamic. She's emerging as the leader of this group of activists. She's really firing them up. and they're all following her. She's dynamic, you know, maybe it was that electrocution, but she's got them in the palm of her hands. She convinces Nick to trees it, which again was a popular technique in the 70s to call attention to the cause of deforestation. And so they climb a tree that is depicted as a human. The tree has a name, it's called Mimas. And it's kind of akin to if any of you have seen the General Sherman tree, it's the oldest tree in the world in Sequoia National Park. I've been lucky enough to see it. That's what Mimas reminded me of. It's just gargantuan. 300 feet tall, 2,000 years old. Here, you know, during the time of Jesus, the book describes. So Nick and Olivia spend an entire year in the canopy of that tree while the loggers are you know, engaging around the tree and trying to convince them to come down. All of their arguments aren't working. During the real Free Cascadia movement, some people were killed when loggers cut the trees and they fell. It didn't happen to Nick and Olivia, but it was close. I mean, the loggers started threatening them with all types of things to get them to come down, but they were devoted to the cause. Olivia was magnificent, and Nick loved her. So they stayed up there for a year, and then finally it just got to the point that they thought they would die if they did not go down. There was a huge storm that came through and scared them. The logging company promised they would not cut the tree, this magnificent 2,000-year-old old growth sequoia. They believed them, which was their mistake. They got down and the tree was killed. It was cut. The loggers lied. It was a very poignant way to end all of this writing. Richard Powers, in interviews, has said that many people wrote to him and said that the death of Mimas affected them more than the experiences, the bad experiences, than any of the human characters of the book had. It was a very sad day when that tree was cut. And it also inflamed these 5 protesters now to not use peaceful means, but to use terroristic means to get their point across to the public and the government, stop deforesting our land. So they elevated their work. They took on code names. So a lot of them took on names of trees that had meant a lot to them. And they went by these names from now on while they were doing their eco-terrorism. And this was over the course of many months, and previously it had been years. These 5 people were devoted to their cause. They started chaining themselves to company equipment. They protested on company building sites. They locked themselves to the building itself. They were all arrested multiple times. They always got out. But at the very end, they were going to make one final huge protest move, and that was going to be an act of arson where they burned a lot of the logging company materials and buildings. So they were using Mimi's engineering knowledge to build bombs. They were amassing all types of arson equipment, and they went in under cover of night to launch their attack. And things went south. Some of the bombs blew up before they were supposed to, and a lot of damage was done. The fire at the company ended up being put out, and their aims weren't completed there. And Olivia, this dynamic, lovely young lady at this point, was killed. And that was a huge turning point in the book. Because that was manslaughter, number 1. You know, these 5 protesters were responsible for her death, so this really escalated things. They were in trouble, you know. So they're okay, you know. They burned Olivia's body on the pyre of the conflagration, they had said it, and they decided to go their own way and try to forget about this whole incident. In the meantime, we have our other 3 characters that never got involved in eco-terrorism that are still described in the trunk section as well. Ray and Dorothy. not too much about them. They find out they can't have children, and it's very sad to them. So they really turn inward to themselves, reading, well, except for Dorothy. She starts having affairs, kind of right and left, and one becomes very serious. Her husband knows about this, but he really loves her. He doesn't say anything. He wants her to stay with him. Then he ends up having a gigantic stroke and becomes incapacitated. So there's that thread that's going on. Neeley starts coding his gigantic MMR game. He calls it Mastery, and releases new versions constantly. And he's lonely. This is really his life, is his coding of his game. But any of you who know teenagers, these gamers spent hundreds of hours playing these games, and there were millions of people now that were playing Neeley's game. He was a wealthy man. He was a billionaire. The people that worked for him were millionaires. They were making bank on their game. He was, by all financial means or descriptions, a success, even though he's so lonely. And then Patricia, our forestry ecologist, our PhD in forestry. She marries Dennis. She's doing great. She's churning out great new research on trees and their communications. She starts writing a book about the beauty and majesty of trees. It's called The Secret Forest, and all of the other characters end up reading the book. That's kind of what ties these three together. Even though they aren't tree enthusiasts, they read her book and they become so. She becomes an expert witness. She just is really the voice of trees, and she's very famous. She also opens a seed bank. She starts storing species of tree seeds in a vault for use in later years. The crown section. This is where all of these characters who came together for arsonist activity split. So now we go back to these individual stories about the remaining 8 characters and what do they do with their lives after the arson. Nick, he is despondent over the loss of Olivia. He goes and camps on the trunk of Mimas. He's just looking for Olivia's soul and her guidance, even though she's dead. Can you guess who he takes a job with by reading this? He's got to pay the bills. Ease is the disease, and Nick is its vector. He works at an Amazon warehouse. It's not very fulfilling, but it pays the bills. And he hates that. He ends up working his way back to Iowa, where the whole chestnut was planted. Before he and Olivia fled there, they buried a bunch of his artwork. And the flip book, he digs it back up. He actually puts that flip book online for people to see. Mimi changes her name to Judith. She really wants to escape, the haze of the arson and all of that. She sells the artwork and the ring that her father left her so that she has a lot of money. She becomes a therapist with this weird way of staring into people's eyes for 4 to 6 hours, and that's her therapy. But she's very successful at it, and she makes a whole new life for herself. Settles in San Francisco. One day she sees a report of the arson that they committed on the news. She gets very frightened that she's going to be caught. Adam continues his thesis. He finishes it based on meeting and interviewing the protesters. He doesn't talk about the arson in the thesis, of course. And he goes on to be a very well-respected psychology professor. He relocates to Manhattan. He marries. He has children. He has a whole new life. But he sees the arson report on TV, too. And he starts worrying. I mean, they're going to get caught, right? This is a big, huge arson. By chance, he runs into Douglas. Remember the Vietnam vet who fell into the banyan tree? And they meet at an Occupy Wall Street protest. They're not in it, they're just observing it. And Douglas hates Adam at this point because Adam was supposed to go and get help to save Olivia's life when she was getting burnt. but he didn't. He chickened out because he didn't want to get caught. And Douglas knows this. Douglas actually then, after this chance meeting, turns Adam in, and he gets arrested, and he is sentenced to life. And he pleads guilty. He feels so bad about it, so he actually does have bad feelings and has a soul. It's kind of like he redeems himself by this act because he's presented as not very good of a character up until this point. Doug, our Vietnam vet who turned Adam in. After the arson, he moves to a BLM cabin in the middle of nowhere out west and is the caretaker of a ghost town. He doesn't see anyone except this one female drifter who comes in. He lets her stay overnight. She reads his journal where he's written down everything about the arson and their work, and she gets arrested for some minor act of violence, and she turns Doug in to save herself as a plea bargain. So he gets arrested too, but he doesn't get sentenced to life, and he does eventually get out. Ray and Dorothy, she continues reading. They read, before they read The Secret Forest, Patricia's book, Ray, who's confined to bed at this point, he can't move, he's an invalid, sees a tree out the window, the only view that he has. He's been looking at it for years, and he asks his wife to tell him what kind of tree it is. She has no idea. They don't know anything about trees. So she keys it out in a field guide. And I don't know if any of you know that tree, but it's an eastern white pine, which we have around here. And they get really into trees. They read Patricia's book, and it makes them feel even more enthralled about trees. What can we do in our limited world here to help trees? Well, what they can do is not spray and mow in their yard, and they decide to let it go wild. Let all the tree seedlings grow in, which is so cool. Neely, he meets a player in Mastery, the game that he created, who is really disenfranchised with playing. He says, what we have here is a Midas problem. There's no end game. Just a stagnant pyramid scheme with endless, pointless prosperity. Those of you who know these games know that part of the goal of the game is to make money in the game to buy things, even sometimes to trade real money with other players in the game. This is not what Neely wanted his game to be, but this is what it had become. He takes his problem to his board of directors at the company, and they're like, you're crazy, I don't want to change that game, it's making me millions. Let's just add more to it. And Neely's like, no, I don't want to do that. I want to take all those hours of gaming time and do something productive with them. I want all of these players out there to be doing a real life building within the game that we can leverage. He also reads The Secret Forest. He finds a copy of that flip book online, and he sees God in it. This is now his new mission, to make a game, basically crowdsourcing the solution to climate change in the game. And Patricia keeps raising money and seeds for her seed bank. She starts writing a book about the seed bank, but this is not a happy book like The Secret Garden was. This is a book about the devastation that we're wreaking on the planet with deforestation, with climate change, using resources faster than we can produce them. It's not cheery. She's pretty disenfranchised, she's pretty bitter. She's invited to speak at a conference at Stanford, and it's about how trees can be used to help combat climate change. She doesn't really want to go, but finally they convince her to do it, to come and give a talk entitled, "The Single Best Thing a Person Can Do." For her, the single best thing a person can do, she talks about in her speech, is to kill yourself. She has on her podium, she has prepared a potion with tree extract that is deadly, and she has it sitting there on the podium. And she starts talking about suicide in her talk. And the audience is stunned, they don't know what to do, and she's about ready to drink it. And Neely happens to be in the audience, and he wheels himself up there. He's the only one that takes action, and waves his arms, shouts, and they kind of leave it. You don't really know if Patricia commits suicide. But she does say in her address, here's to unsuicide. So my guess, and most of the comments that I've read online, are that she doesn't commit suicide. She just comes very close to it. So in the final 30 pages of the book, then, it does summarize what these characters go on to do in positive ways to help to solve some of the problems. And it does leave a bit of hope. And I'll just close with those hopeful statements. So Nick, our artist, ends up staying in the Pacific Northwest, and he builds this gigantic sculpture on the ground out of logs, and this indigenous group, arrives, and they're helping him with this project, and they spell out a gigantic, big enough to be seen from space, word, still. We're still here. Nature still survives. If we're still, we can hear nature speaking to us. Mimi is feeling very guilty about her role in killing Olivia. She's sitting in a park one day, and it hits her what Doug and Adam have done for her. They both turned themselves in. They've both gone to prison to save Mimi and Nick. They are absolved. No, they will not be arrested. And she just has a revelation. Things might be broken, but nature continues. There are seeds that need fire, seeds that need freezing. Sometimes things have to be smashed open before they'll germinate. So she thinks, well, they couldn't get too much worse, but now sometimes that's what it takes to get better. Ray and Dorothy, they're rewilding their yard. It's going great. They feel good about this. They feel great about their small contribution to conservation and repopulating tree populations. Ray does end up dying, but he dies happy. Nile, he breaks with his board of directors. He does what he wants to do with his game. He takes it down to bare bones. He builds it up in a way that the players are spending all that time creating a world online that uses resources wisely, with the hope that maybe that will be able to be crowdsourced to solve real world problems. He knows he'll never see that happen, but he is content knowing at least he gave it the kickstart. And then Patricia, if she truly survives, or if she doesn't, her predecessors will be able to take all those seeds in her seed bank, even from trees that are now extinct, and go out there and replant. So the themes that came across here are that humans and trees are truly connected with themselves, above ground and under, and with us. That they provide valuable resources. Richard Powers talks about how they purify water and air, give us forestry products, and give us peace and a feeling of happiness being within them. The relationship that we have with trees is broken. He tries to convey that. If you take them for granted as just mere objects, we tend to abuse them and cut them all down. And that we can and we do destroy entire tree communities that have been there for thousands and thousands of years, centuries. And we don't think about it. We don't treat them as sentient beings. We just cut them down for our own use. And to save trees and ourselves, he makes the point that trees are just as important as humans. Do we have the right to be cutting them all down? We really need a paradigm shift to think about living in harmony with them and the rest of nature, and use it wisely and have hope, which is what our characters back here showed us that we have. So I'm sorry I ran 10 minutes over. It was a very difficult book to summarize because it was so long and intricate, but I hope you'll read it and stick with it. Many people I've talked to loved it, but not everybody. But if you like reading about trees and fungal networks, here are some other suggested books, some of them recommended by Richard Powers in interviews that I've read with him, and some books that I've read that are just very wonderful and educational books about trees. So thank you for hanging in there and listening.